Hey everybody. Hey guys.
Hey,
How's
Hello.
it going? Time for another lectionary psalm reflection.
woo!
Today we've got Psalm 126, which is a little guy. It's a really short one, and it's a great one and an interesting one. And there's some really crazy textual stuff going on,
Mm.
and some really interesting historical stuff going on. So there's a little teaser. Should we read it? You guys ready?
Yes, I
Do
will
it.
read Psalm 126. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dreamed. Our mouths were filled with laughter, our tongues with songs of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are filled with joy. Restore our fortunes, Lord, like streams in the Negev. Those who sow tears will reap songs of joy. Those who go out weeping carry seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them. That's it. 6 verses of pure gold.
Pure gold. It is a good one, isn't it? So Psalm 126 is the seventh Psalm of Ascent. And the Psalms of Ascent, I think, Sam, you probably know more about this than I do, but they were like pilgrimage psalms for the journey to Jerusalem. People would recite these and pray these as they journeyed to Jerusalem as pilgrims. And so a lot of these psalms have to do with um, arriving in Zion, or the beauty of Zion, or the struggle of the journey, this kind of thing. So this psalm. Oh, and I should say we have our. I'm gonna pull it up so I don't forget the three things that are guiding our discussion,
Oh, yeah.
which I
What
have.
stood out to you? What do we
Yeah.
learn about God? How does this psalm help us to pray?
Yes. What stood out? What do we learn about God? How does this psalm help us pray? So those are the three things we're processing as we go through this. Um, I appreciate how this gets used as an Advent psalm, which is kind of interesting because there's this discussion of being exiles, and now we're kind of on our way back, or we are back, and we're enjoying being back. And so there is for us during this Advent season this little nugget of celebration. Usually, Advent is just kind of waiting. And here in this psalm, we're already kind of taking that joy on our lips and saying, "Isn't this wonderful? We're on our way to Zion." Even though we're still waiting for it, we're anticipating it so intensely that it's already giving us joy. I'll let you guys jump in for a bit.
I'll just jump in too, as we're kind of laying a foundation. Is that one commentary I read was trying to place this psalm in actual history. Like, so when is this written? Like,
Right.
what are they responding to? And there was one commentator that said, um, it sounds like they were in captivity, they were in exile in Babylon. Um, they were allowed to go back home, and so they come home, and the psalm almost makes it sound like um, what they're coming home to is so amazing. Like everything is restored, everything is perfect, everything is amazing as they come back to their homeland. So it's a sort of homecoming. Uh, but in reality, what the exiles came home to was not that great. Everything was
Mm,
burned, the walls were broken down, the temple was destroyed. And even when they rebuilt the temple, like, I don't know if you remember this, I forget exactly what book it's in, but when they rebuilt it, people cried.
mm,
Not because they were so happy, but because they remembered the former temple, and the one they rebuilt was kind of like a shack.
yeah.
And so people were just like grieved to their hearts. And so it's like, okay, so Psalm 126, like, when is this? Like, when did this happen? Like, when were people laughing with joy and rejoicing and all this stuff? And So the commentator I read said something like, um, the writer of the psalm is kind of anticipating how it will all be in the,
Mm,
and so why that's why it's an Advent psalm, is because we're getting a glimpse of a restored city,
mhm,
or not a temporary homecoming, but like a true homecoming.
mm,
Like we're coming home, and it's going to be really, really great.
mm. That's really cool. That's really interesting. Um, so part of that historical placing of this psalm is that so we call the psalms like the psalms of David, right? And David wrote a lot of them. Well, David lived, or a lot of his stuff is rooted in a time period that's about 1000 BC. Well, the exile was about 500 BC. So we're talking about 500 years, which is so much time between the time that David lived and this psalm about the exile, about the return from exile, was added to the Psalter,
Mm.
which I think speaks to kind of the living nature of the liturgy and the participation of God's people in God's story. So, is this a psalm about returning from exile in Ezra Nehemiah in 500 BC? Yeah, but also like it travels with us places and it travels with us to different times. And so we can take this psalm on our lips and it can mean something for us, which we want to understand the historical context, at least whatever we can from it. But we're not limited by that. The, the compilers of the Psalter were not limited by that because they're like, hey, this is 500 years late, but we're going to put this one in there, or we're going to add some new ideas to this psalm that's been in there for 500 years. We don't know exactly what they did, but it's very much a living, breathing liturgy, which I think is so cool.
Yeah, I think it's cool that is it Pastor Mary on Sunday sort of referenced Book of Revelation, and that he will wipe every tear from our eyes and sort of restore everything. And this sort of the idea of this time warp between, past, present, and even future is is very much sort of rooted in the way that we read that book too. It's like you have these historical events in the Book of Revelation. You also have this sort of future kingdom that God is going to set up with his people, and he's going to wipe away all the sadness that we see at the end of this. Those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy. He who goes out weeping, carrying seed to sow. And that's also cool, like in terms of what we're celebrating in Advent, where we sort of know the end of the story. We're celebrating this ancient tradition, but we're also living into our own Advent right now in the middle of coronavirus. And but what I see in all of this is that it's like, again, I think it's sort of what we talked about last week, is that you're sort of living into the present reality, which includes darkness and pain and sorrow and all of these things. But then there's this deep, deep sense of hope, constantly hope, hope, hope. And it's like, in a sense, it's like I feel like there's this groping and yearning to want to see into the future. But yet what's cool about the Christian faith is we already know what that future is. And so it's really sort of leaning into that knowledge, that is what gives us the hope. So I think I just love this song. I also love the agricultural sort of references of carrying sheaves of, what is it, bundles of wheat and stuff with you.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the idea of sort of sowing with tears, it's just really extraordinary language.
Yeah. What's interesting about that is I'm preaching on Isaiah 61 this coming Sunday. And so Psalm 126 and Isaiah 61 get paired up in the lectionary. And what's interesting about that is in Isaiah 61, salvation is compared to two things, which I'm going to talk about: a restored city and a flourishing garden. And so those are the two images used in Isaiah 61. So you're already picking up like why. I mean, here again, it's like this idea of seeds and reaping a harvest. So there's something about like it's hard for us to imagine what a restored creation will truly look like. And so we're given some like metaphors or some images to kind of help us imagine
Mm-hmm.
like that complete flourishing and that complete like explosion of life and color and vibrancy and texture that is going to happen. But it's almost like it's too much for us to wrap our minds around. And
Hmm.
yet we can catch a glimpse of it. Like we get a taste of it in communion,
Mm,
right? We don't get the whole loaf, we just get a piece.
Hmm.
We just take one sip of the cup. We don't drink the whole cup. We
Hmm.
get a taste and we get a glimpse and we get a hint. We can kind of smell it a little bit. It's in the air,
Hmm.
but we're not eating the whole meal yet. It's still yet to come.
Hmm. We begin to enter that rhythm, and we can recognize that rhythm around us as it continues to pan out.
Yeah.
That makes me think of verse 5. Those who sow with tears will reap with songs of joy. Um, so there's this image of um, planting a seed, sowing a seed in grief, and then harvesting the fruit, the crop of the seed in joy, which like that's death and resurrection, right? Like this is our thing. This is what we do. This is Christianity. It's death and resurrection.
Mm.
And so there's this sowing in pain. There is carrying our cross. There is, John 12 says, unless a kernel of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it cannot, produce its fruit. So that's the kind of thing that's going on there. One thing I found really interesting. Um, so in verse 4, I don't know what version you guys have there, but I'm reading. This is the same thing we have in our pews. Um, Restore our fortunes, Lord, like the streams of the Negev. And then there's a footnote there that says, and this is would be the more literal translation. Instead of restore our fortunes, bring back our captives,
Mm.
which is interesting.
mhm,
And so I did a little bit of work on that. And so the same word that's used in verse 4 for fortunes or captives is the same word that's used in verse 1 for fortunes or captives, depending on your. And so there's this marrying of our captivity and our fortunes,
Mm.
our grief and our joy,
Mm.
our death and our resurrection. And in verse 4, the request is remind us of our captivity, remind us where we've been, um, take us to that part of our rhythm over and over again so that we when we remember our death, when we remember our captivity, we will live more fully into our resurrection, which I just think is fantastically cool. And I can't wait to hear Sam preach a sermon on that someday.
Thank you.
um, what do we learn about God? How does this psalm help us to pray?
I think the number one thing is that learning to pray in our tears
Mm.
and trusting God's abundance in those moments.
That's
I would say,
And also praying with a sense of freedom while being captive.
hmm.
You know, I mean, there's so many stories of people basically, in the literal sense in prison, but then coming out and saying, "Man, I felt like in a sense more free when I was in jail than when I was out because I felt God's presence with me, or there's some sort of like liberation from all the stuff that has less meaning in my life, um, and I don't know, there's a metaphor in there somewhere for us in our more normative lives, but I think that we can, yeah, just that holding on, to hope and freedom no matter what.
Mhm. There's a
That's
bit
right.
in the song. I would echo that, Cameron. That's really good about, um, God's not. He's mentioned a few times in this passage. It's mostly gossip, where other people are seeing what's happening, and so other people are talking about what God is doing. So they're saying, "The Lord has done great things for them. Look what the Lord has done for His people." And then the psalmist reflects on that and says, yeah, God has done great things for us. But then the prayer comes in verse 4, restore our fortunes, Lord. And so that's the prayer. That's what we learn about God is the one who's going to do this. We participate in it, but we don't bring it about ultimately. It's God who restores, who's going to make all things new. That's what God's going to do. And so our prayer during Advent and our prayer using Psalm 126 is, Lord, come quickly. Lord, make all things new. Lord, wipe away the tears from our eyes. And then we can also echo Psalm 40. How long, O Lord? We've been waiting forever. I love those two things paired up. Come quickly and you're going too slow. Come quickly. So anyways, Stefan, anything?
What's that?
Anything about what do you learn about God, or how does this help you to pray? And then we'll talk about the song, the musical setting of this.
Yeah, I would say that we learn most about God and participate best in God when we're taking a long view of things.
Mm-hmm.
Like these folks who are, in one sense looking in Zion, and that joy is in their mouth, but at the same time they're remembering the seeds that were sown with tears. And so taking a long view and praying with a long view, I think there's a lot of hope there. I think there's a lot of peace there, especially as we're struggling with things that feel so immediate. Cameron, what do you got for us this week?
Yeah, so this is a song that's very familiar to me. I've sung it a couple times here, even at Alger Park, studying of Psalm 126. And I wanted to just follow up on something Sam said too about the idea of sort of God, being the verb that's the only one that is restoring us and giving us that sense of joy, even with our tears, because the opening lines of the way they set the psalm was, our mouths, they were filled with laughter. Our tongues, they were loosed with joy. And I love that word loosed. It's almost like, it's like, I don't know, what Moses with his speech impediment or whatever. And suddenly like God just like untangles the tongue so that you can praise, but I love the way it's phrased in the song because it really gives credit to God. But I learned this song from a friend who, well, I'll tell the story, but I met all these guys when I was living in Baltimore, and one moved to Montana, we moved to Michigan, and then our other friend stayed in Maryland. So we have the MMM, Maryland, Michigan, Montana connection. And throughout the course of the years, we would invite this sort of little team of musicians to each other's M state. So they came out to Michigan, we did a concert and a worship service together. Then our friend from Montana brought us to Montana. Well, our friend Val was in this group, and she also had a Michigan connection, even though she was from Maryland, and that she met her husband at Calvin and everything. Anyway, they were on vacation, and he tragically drowned to death in Lake Michigan. And all of a sudden we get this invitation, and we invite Val to do this worship service. I don't know how many months this was. So this is the first time we've seen Val after she lost her husband and left her with 3 kids. And so she shows up and we lead this worship service together. And she and David, our friend from Montana who brought us out, taught us this song. And there's something about literally her singing for, this is a small little church in the middle of nowhere, Montana. Everybody is a rancher. The entire church is all ranchers. This was their big event when all the ranchers come out of the hills and they come to church on Sunday. And just hearing her sing, what is the bit? Yeah, those who sow in tears will reap with songs of joy, to us, and singing it to this agricultural community. It just totally embodied this song, and it's burned in my heart. So every time I sing it, like there's no other version other than Val's version. So I recorded this version over the summer when we were doing our online worship service, but maybe I'll ask her permission, and in a couple weeks I can share a recording that we did in Maryland together to complete the 3M state tour of hearing her sing it. So it was just a really powerful experience.
That is so great. I can't wait to hear the song.
Yeah. Well, you've heard it before, but
Right.
but yeah, I would love, it's so funny because it's one of these songs that I love, but sort of whenever I don't know if it's not singable enough for a congregation, but just never carries the weight when I've done it with congregations before. And I'm always like, why, Lord? Like, why isn't this? So maybe it's just a more sort of personal, maybe without that personal engagement, it doesn't hold up as a congregational worship song, but I just love it. So
Awesome. Can't wait to hear it. Again, thanks, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Take care.
Our mouths they were filled with laughter. Our tongues they were loose with joy. Restore us, O Lord. Restore us, O Lord. Although we are weeping, Lord, help us keep sowing the seeds of your kingdom, for the day you will reap them. Your sheaves we will carry. Lord, please do not tarry. All those who sow weeping will go out with songs of joy. The nations will say, He has done great things. The nations will sing songs of joy. Restore us, O Lord. Restore us, O Lord. Although we are weeping, Lord, help us keep sowing the seeds of your kingdom, for the day you will reap them. Your sheaves we will carry. Lord, please do not tarry. All those who sow weeping go out with songs of joy. All those who sow weeping go out with songs of joy. All those who sow weeping go out with songs